So, at the end of last year, I was asked if I'd like to give a lecture in the UC Connect series, and I was given the choice of topic. So, at the time, the first thing that occurred to me was the very high-profile public and media debate that we'd been having about whether our rivers and lakes are, or even whether they should be, considered safe for swimming. Now, this is not a debate about physical safety, those basic things about water safety, such as looking out for submerged objects, high flow and deep water. This is about the potential for getting ill from swimming in contaminated water. I was also thinking about the looming holiday period and the fact that within a few months we would all be making exactly those kind of decisions about whether and when and where we could swim on our holidays. Now, I volunteered a lecture designed to help people access the type of information they needed to know whether they could swim safely and to understand that information so we could all make the right decisions when we're standing in front of these water bodies. Which all goes to show I should read my email a lot more carefully, because it turned out that the lecture was not until this year, well after the holiday season, actually even after the swimming season itself had finished. So while this is a less immediate concern than it was at the end of last year, it is still a major issue. It's a very high profile, long-term concern for the New Zealand public, for our tourists, for our tourism industry, even for New Zealand, somewhat battered these days, 100% pure, clean and green image. So, here we are on the cusp of winter, with snow on the hills this morning I saw, which is exciting, rugged up in our coats and scarves, about to talk about swimming in cold Canterbury rivers. It doesn't sound quite right, does it? So I'm going to take one for the team here. I've brought my swimming goggles. And don't worry, it's not a swimsuit. I have hauled on my wetsuit. Okay. It's probably the most applause I've ever had in a lecture. Because I want us to be focused on, for the next 45 minutes, there'll be 15 minutes Q&A afterwards, but I want us to really focus on whether we can swim safely in our freshwater lakes and rivers. Don't want to get diverted into drinking water problems, don't want to get diverted into ecosystem issues. We are focused on swimming. This wetsuit is here to remind you. It's here to remind me too, because it's like all good wetsuits, it's a bit tight when it's dry, so every time I take a big breath, it's going to remind me that we are focused on swimming. So, back in the day, when my father was a lad, in the 1950s, he had many epic tramping trips to the Canterbury high country. He also tramped in the North Island, he was a canoeist, he spent a lot of time in the rivers. Now, at that time, they swam with complete confidence that they would not get sick, and they could even drink the water in those river systems. Roll us forward 70 years or so, and we have quite a different proposition, don't we? We have lost that confidence. We know now that there's more to swimming safely than just looking for submerged objects, high flow and deep water. We know that there are things in that water that can do us some considerable degree of harm if we're not careful. In Canterbury, of course, we have the poster child, really, of this problem at Coes Ford. And certainly last year, when the issues of safe swimming were being very hotly debated, Coes Ford was one that you saw in the media a lot. The communities of Selwyn remember Coes Ford in the 1960s as a clear, deep, clean water, one that was well suited to family picnics and family swimming days. This picture is from an archive of old photos of the Selwyn region, probably taken around 1960, the Marshall family, apparently, for the record. Roll the time on again to 2017, and the Coast Ford swimming spot was in the worst state it has been in living memory. There was no flow in the water, there were a few puddles left, and it was choked with algae, wasn't it? Now, there's no doubt that the 3 years of drought we'd had up until summer 2017 was a contributing factor here. But the Selwyn's quality and the amount of water in the Selwyn has been going pretty steadily downhill in recent years. And with increased irrigation in the catchment and more intense farming in the catchment, you don't have to look very far to see why. We have a quite different water quality at Coes Ford than we might have had 50 or 60 years ago. So as I said, this was the poster child. It has caused a certain amount of ill feeling in the community, understandably perhaps. Clearly it's no longer their treasured swimming spot. But is this representative of what's happening throughout the Canterbury region? ECAN do a roundup of all their summer season monitoring data. So throughout summer, they monitor very regularly at the popular swimming spots to see how the water quality is tracking with regard to safe swimming and safe recreation. Then last year, they put together a summary of all the data up until the previous summer to see what grade could be given to most of those swimming spots. They determined that 76% of the swimming sites that we commonly use around Canterbury are suitable for swimming. They are graded fair or better. Fair is the yellow, good is the green, very good is blue on these pie charts. So overall, about 3/4 of our sites are okay for swimming. If you're swimming at fair sites, you've got to be a little bit better informed about what the risks might be. Good and very good, you should be able to relax and swim. We'll talk about how these guidelines are derived in a minute. It was slightly better for the lakes. Around 90% of our lakes are good for swimming, or okay for swimming, let's call it, but somewhat less for our streams and rivers, about 70%. Now, there was some good news in the ECAN report, that we were seeing trends that suggested that things, some of our rivers were getting better, but still this is not a great result. It does mean that over 30% of our streams and rivers are not suitable for swimming. Is this what we see throughout New Zealand? I have no idea what it's done there. If we look at the national compilation of data, now this is done slightly differently from the way ECAN does it, not better, not worse, just differently. It looks at the kilometres of rivers affected. We can see that Canterbury, in that figure there, indicates that 80% of our lengths of water in Canterbury are okay for swimming. Now, this is only considering what the Ministry for the Environment, who put this data together, considered to be potentially swimmable waterways. So that is a relatively large river. They call it Order 4, fourth order river, which means that a number of smaller rivers have come into one, giving it a fair body of water, or a lake with greater than 1.5 kilometre perimeter. So they're making some pretty distinct groupings there to be considered as swimmable. Notice this new word in our lexicon, the swimmability of a river. You won't find it in a dictionary, but it is taken to mean in New Zealand whether that river is safe for swimming in or not. Look at the South Island sites. Those are all these ones on the right-hand side here. They're definitely better than the typical regions in the North Island. In some regions, Northland, Auckland, Waikato, Taranaki and Manawatu, less than half of their waters are okay for swimming. That's a pretty bad indictment of what's going on in those regions. So we're looking pretty sweet at 80%. As I said, most South Island sites are pretty good. These colours relate to the same kind of colour scheme that ECAN uses. The yellow indicates that you should be aware there are some problems, but it's still okay to swim. The green is good. The blue is very good. Overall, in New Zealand, 72% of our rivers and lakes are considered good enough for swimming. Now, this is a grade based on historical data, okay? It's not a day-to-day grade. It's based on an amalgamation of all the data that has gone before to suggest whether that's a good or a poor or a fair site for swimming. Looking at this another way, this is using the same kind of data, but it shows some quite important features. When we plot that out spatially, we can see that most of the very good swimming areas are in the highlands, aren't they? They follow the spine of the Southern Alps through the South Island. They carry that up through the high hills of the North Island, through the Rimutakas and Tararuas and up into the Kaimanawas. And so lakes and rivers in these higher regions, including Lake Taupo on the Central Plateau, are in pretty good shape. But look what happens as you come out towards the coast. Suddenly our rivers and streams are looking a lot less healthy for swimming. Now, this makes perfect sense. Of course, there's a lot of land use activity that goes on between the highlands and the coast, but it's particularly problematic because this is where our population is as well, isn't it? If somebody wants to go for a dip, they don't want to drive all the way up into the hills and go for a swim in Lake Coleridge, which for the record is very good for swimming. They want to nip down to Coes Ford, or they want to go to one of the lakes that are nearer the coast, one of the coastal lagoons. So this is a problem, that the near coastal regions of our lakes and rivers are universally of the worst quality, and you can virtually track dairy and farming activity in New Zealand by looking at where these occur. So high dairy regions, especially areas like Southland, parts of Canterbury, Taranaki, Manawatu, the Waikato and parts of Northland are having a major effect on our water systems. So looked at another way, about a third of our potentially swimmable lakes and rivers, those that are big enough, are considered unsuitable for swimming at this point, and only about a half of them are good or excellent for swimming. That's not very encouraging, is it? If we want to think more carefully about this, we have to look at how safe for swimming is assessed. Now, I have to warn you, there's some very light touch of statistics here, okay? But it's because when we set guidelines for swimming, they are statistically based. So I will try and be as kind as possible, but there will be some numbers involved. So how do we assess it? Our most direct way of assessing whether water is safe for swimming is to measure the degree of contamination by sewage. For that, we measure one single organism in freshwater systems, which is E. coli, a very tiny bacteria. Our second way of assessing it is to look for the presence of cyanobacteria. These are types of what you would recognise probably as algal mats, algal buildup, that are capable of producing toxins. They can occur as mats on the substrate. They can also occur in the water column, where they make the water column go green and milky looking. We look at the history and vulnerability of the site. So that's its reputation, if you like. How has it stacked up in the past? What is the nature of the catchment around it that might lead to pressures that reduce its quality? And clarity. Clarity has typically been used nationally to judge water safety. If water is unclear, you shouldn't be getting into it, you can't see submerged hazards, etc. And in fact, when the RMA came into being in 1981, this was one of the first standards that came out for judging safe swimming, was whether the water was clear or not. Not so good to apply that in Canterbury, is it? We have a lot of glacial-fed river systems, which we consider beautiful and perfectly okay for swimming, that wouldn't pass the clarity test. So the application of clarity to judge safe swimming in Canterbury has always been a little bit of a problem. Let's take a closer look at E. coli. E. coli is a tiny little bacteria, usually sort of around the 1 to 3 micron size. That's 1 to 3 thousandth of a millimetre in size. A very small organism to put this amount of faith in. It's present in the gut of all warm-blooded animals, so you, me, birds, cats, dogs, sheep, dairy cows, pigs, whatever. Universal. That means it's universally present in the sewage from those sources as well. Why we use it is because it is readily detected. It's easy to find, it's easy to measure. So we can tell how abundant it is, and that's a degree of how contaminated the water is. And if it's there, it signals that other bacteria and pathogens, disease-causing organisms that can do you harm, will also be there, or may also be there. So if you've got E. coli there, you might have the presence of bacteria such as things like Salmonella, Campylobacter, which we've heard quite a lot about recently, the kind of bacteria that cause botulism and cholera, not to put too fine a point on it, the kind of viruses that cause hepatitis, and norovirus, the kind of protozoa like Giardia, which I'm sure you've all heard of, and Cryptosporidium. Those things will make you very ill very quickly, but they're hard to detect, hard to measure. So we measure E. coli. If you've got a lot of E. coli, very good chance you've got some of these other things there as well. One of the problems is that when we see E. coli in a river, we don't know where it's come from. There are multiple sources of E. coli, any warm-blooded animal. How do we know where that E. coli has come from? Because where it comes from gives us an indication of how risky it might be. There is a lot of human pathogens that are present in human sewage but not present in sewage from other sources. May not be present in sewage from birds, for example, from wildlife. So currently we don't have many tools to determine this. ESR, one of the Crown Research Institutes, is working on this as we speak. They are trying to find ways to better identify where that E. coli has come from and how risky it is in terms of pathogens. This confusion about E. coli and its use for safe swimming has led to a lot of mudslinging in the media. Nick Smith gave an address at Lincoln University, his State of the Environment address in 2016, and just made an offhand comment at the end because he was being pressured about swimmable lakes, swimmable rivers. And he said, if you wanted that lake to be totally swimmable, and I can't offhand remember which lake he was referring to, you would need to cull all the birds, because that's the only way you could get the E. coli down to a level that would be considered safe for swimming. Whereupon everybody took umbrage that the minister was blaming the birds for bad water. Just an indication of where the confusion comes in when people are talking about E. coli and relating it directly to this safety issue. The other thing about E. coli is it's highly variable data. By that I mean it's up one day and down the next. As an illustration of this, and to introduce you gently to statistics, I have gathered some data from ECAN's website. It's from their routine water quality monitoring that they do at Coastford. Anybody can find this, it's on their website. I've plotted it up over time. It's just their monthly monitoring. It's not the recreational monitoring that they do during the bathing season. But you can see that variability, can't you? You can see that on about 11 occasions we had really high E. coli levels that were quite spotty. And most of the time they relate to high flow events, when rainfall washes all the E. coli off the land and into the water. But how do we then use E. coli to judge how safe this site is for swimming? If we said that any site that has over 2,000 E. coli per 100 mils during the monitoring record is not considered safe for swimming, then most of our swimming sites would be out of bounds. So you can't use just an occasional exceedance. So how often do you allow a site to exceed the criteria that you think are applicable? The first criteria that we ever had for assessing recreational safety were from the Ministry of Health and Minister for the Environment, came out in 2003. They were pretty comprehensive and they've been used extensively. They had a couple of guidelines. They said below 260 E. coli per 100 mils of water, you can be pretty safe, right? The risk of infection is really low. Consider that good. There's an upper limit of 550 per 100 mil where you're a little bit more dodgy, okay? But that 550 per 100 mil is globally recognised as a 5% infection risk, okay? So your chances, and that's considered acceptable for swimming. And that's not just New Zealand, that's all over. That's the World Health Organisation recommendation. So they also have this higher limit at 550 where they say, as long as you're below this, you should be okay. You'd be better if you were at 260, but this area in the middle where some attention is being paid to more frequent monitoring perhaps and gathering more data. So we've got about 11 occasions during this monitoring period where we were well above that limit. That's when your no swimming signs would have gone up had these monitoring been done during the swimming season. But let's think about how we can still use this data to get an overall grade for the system. So looking at these two limits here, we use something called percentiles, and these carry through into just about all the guidelines for swimming safety. For example, 11 sites exceeded the 550 guideline. There's about 183 sites here. So that means that about 95% of the data fell below this guideline. 95 or the 95th percentile value is used a lot in assessing safety for swimming. It's the value that 95% of the data is below. So 95% of the data here were below the 550 per 100 mils. That would actually make it perfectly okay for swimming. You can also use other percentiles. For example, and I did a quick analysis of this, 80% of the data falls below the 260 point. So that's an 80th percentile. There's one more that's really useful, and that is the median. So 95th percentile, the median is the 50th percentile. It's exactly the middle value of the data. So half the data is below that. Now the median and the 95th percentile, so most of the data below, half the data below that value, are used very commonly to assess safety for swimming and wading. Is everybody following me so far? I haven't had anybody roll their eyes and tip over, so we'll just carry on. So how is this used on a regular basis? Well, first of all, how does ECAN use this to judge the quality of their sites around the region as a general guideline? They pretty much follow the textbook method recommended by the Ministry of Health. They assess the usual state of a swimming site and give it a grade based on the SIC and the MAC. Now the SIC is a bit ironic, isn't it? Because SIC is what we're trying to avoid, but it stands for Sanitary Inspection Category. It's a measure of what the pressures are in that catchment. How likely is it that the water is going to be contaminated by fecal matter? It's just a very low, low, moderate, high, very high sort of grading. But if you're downstream from a municipal sewage treatment plant, then you're going to get a very high grading, aren't you, on the SIC scale? If you're in the middle of the bush on the west coast, you're going to get a very low grading. It's all about potential sources of fecal material in that catchment. The MAC is the Microbial Assessment category, which is your E. coli numbers. So this is taken directly from ECAN summary reports, an excellent example of how this is used. You give the freshwater a grade based on its microbial content, and notice the 95th percentile over 5 years of data is what's being used here. So it comes out as an A if it's less than 130, it comes out as a B if it's less than 160. C if it's less than 550, greater than 550 is a D. Swimming usually cuts off about here. And you compare that to the sanitary inspection category. So something, if it's an A and it's a low sanitary inspection category, then it gets that very, very good grade. That was the blue on those initial pie charts. If it's a B and it's low or moderate sanitary inspection category, then it's good. If it's a C and it's low, moderate, it will get a fair, sorry. If it's high, it'll get a poor. And here's where Coes Ford fits over here at the moment, 95 percentile of 5 years data from the recreational monitoring survey, not the monitoring data I showed you, is around 770 the 95th percentile, so it's well above that 550, and it's got a moderate SIC, so it's currently listed as poor. The ones that say follow-up means that it seems a bit odd if you've got lots of sources of fecal matter in the catchment and you've got really good water quality. It means you need to look into that a bit more carefully and find out what's going on, doesn't it? The second step of this two-step process kicks into action as soon as the swimming season begins, and that is weekly monitoring of all the popular swimming sites for the duration of the swimming season. So that's usually November through to March, down here anyway. And depending on what result you get, and you have a result within 24 hours for E. coli data, that site will either be under normal surveillance. If you get a good result, you just continue weekly monitoring. You'll move into alert phase if you're between 261 and 550, which means you need to beef up the monitoring a bit and see if there's any sources of fecal material in the catchment. But if it's greater than 550, action stations, signs go up, don't swim here until further notice. And there are signs go up in the paper as well, notifications. So that's how E. coli is used on its own. Remember, there were other things involved in safe swimming. One of them was cyanobacteria. There are some types of cyanobacteria that produce neurotoxins. Those neurotoxins can have an effect on the health of people. It can cause skin irritations, and some people it can cause respiratory distress. There are rumours that it's called fatalities, but they're from the outside world, so who knows whether we should believe them. But the reputation it has in Canterbury and New Zealand as a whole is for what? Killing dogs. Dogs can eat these mats, particularly what we call the benthic ones, the ones that grow on the hard substrates, and they will die very quickly. It's a very rapid response. So what should you be looking for? There are two types of cyanobacteria in Canterbury that give rise to most of our problems for benthic mats, ones that stick to the bottom. One is Phamidium, which forms those black sort of velvety or leathery, actually they look like wetsuit, mats on the bottom of the river. And the other one is Nostoc, which is a particularly yucky looking cyanobacteria, kind of khaki globs of goop, really, is the nicest way to put it. In the water column, if cyanobacteria are blooming, they will make the water look very green. Here's a good example here from the Pariora River. This example here is from Wairua, Lake Forsyth, out by Little River, and this sign went up directly in response to this type of algal bloom. So if you're seeing a lot of green in the water, if you're seeing a lot of these kind of mats, there are lots of totally benign algae that grow on the bottom of a river as well. But if you're seeing these kind of mats, then you know that you have got quite high concentrations of cyanobacteria, and signs will go up if these turn up during the council monitoring during the recreational season. There's a whole pile of other considerations which we don't hear very much about. If you go back to some of the older guidelines that we have around for recreational water safety, they recommend the microbial guidelines, which is the E. coli. They recommend guidelines for nuisance organisms, but they have a whole bunch of other things. How good does it look? Is it clear? What colour is the water? What's its pH is, so that's a measure of acidity or alkalinity. What temperature it is, I'm not quite sure how you're supposed to judge that for as a guideline for safe swimming. And a whole bunch of toxic chemicals. There's something like 150 listed there, over which 100 are pesticides. You'd only be looking for these things if you had reason to believe they were in the catchment and they were going to be a problem. Oil and debris also. But my second reason for putting this table up is it's our first introduction to two types of recreational contact, which becomes important in a second. Primary contact is considered full immersion in water, i.e. swimming, or the kind of boating that can turn into full immersion quite quickly, usually accidentally. Secondary contact is wading, so just up to your knees, or the kind of boating that's a bit more secure, where you don't expect to be fully immersed in the water. That distinction, which seems like just a fairly arbitrary distinction in these old guidelines, came to have very significant meaning for New Zealand as we started to try and derive some national guidelines. This is where the whole, is it wadeable or is it swimmable, and what should we protect to debate came into being. And it raged for 3 years between 2014 and 2017, on and off. What kicked it off was the generation of our first national policy statement for freshwater. We've been waiting for this for a really long time. Some serious guidance from national level government about how we should manage freshwater in New Zealand. All good. Lots of it was fine. In the back, they had a series of tables which gave specific limits for various things in water, which would allow you to judge the quality of your water. There were 2 particular things they wanted water to be protected for: ecosystem habitat and human health for recreation. Now, if you look at the table in the back, this is going to be frightening, just brace yourselves. Right, if you look at the table in the back that pertains to E. coli, we have numbers that you should be recognising at this point, if you can read them. A-grade water would have less than 260, okay, that's straight from the MAF guidelines. If it's an annual median, so half the monitoring data meets that limit, then it's okay for wading, that's secondary contact. If 95% of the data meets it, then it's okay for swimming. In fact, it's really good for swimming, very low risk of infection. B is in that kind of medium zone that we saw in the MAF guidelines, between 260 and 540. Annual median, okay for swimming. 95th percentile, okay for swimming. Not as good as an A grade, but still you should be moderately safe. All good. C, greater than 540, swimming drops out. Okay, that's exactly the same as the MAF guidelines. We don't any longer consider a C grade river to be swimmable. So we just go down now to annual medians for wadability. The part that got everybody upset, including yours truly, was that this is where they put the national bottom line, right? So the national bottom line, our default value for rivers and lakes in New Zealand was less than swimmable quality. You could wade, and if you look at the wording, they're very, very clear about this, that if you wade in that water, you have a less than 5% risk of infection, which is that magic number. However, if you are immersed in that water, you have a greater than 5% risk. Now, this is turned out not to be an acceptable state of affairs for most New Zealanders who are interested in the outdoors, and we're not prepared to accept that lower level as the default value for New Zealand waters. We do not want to be standing beside rivers that look perfectly okay, wondering if we're going to get sick if we do more than wade in them. We want a higher default value. So after 3 years of pressure and quite a lot of rather nasty headlines in the media, the government had another go. In early 2017, they came out with another set of proposals, another set of guidelines for judging swimmability, another horrible table, just a minute. And they reissued the National Policy Statement with a new table in it. And it was quite different. It was very difficult to compare to what had come previously, because it was again all about statistics, medians, 95th percentiles, but now they were starting to focus on the percentage of time that guidelines were exceeded, right? So I was starting to worry about some of those top points and how often they occurred. So it's a more complex picture than it used to be. We still have A, B, C, D, and actually there's an E, which wouldn't fit on the page. But swimming stops here at C, all right? So at C, we've got a 95th percentile, which is quite high by comparison to what we had previously, but a median that's quite low, and some restrictions on the number of times, or the percentage of time, a water can exceed the guidelines for. The big benefit of this, from my point of view, was there was no national bottom line identified. We're no longer saying that if we have a river that's wadable, that's good enough, we can rest on our laurels. Now we have a bit of a stepladder of improvement, and we need to embark on that step ladder and push rivers up, improve their grade over time. And that is in fact exactly the purpose of the document, Clean Water. It had a whole bunch of initiatives in it and actions in it which are designed to push more of our rivers up that scale. So part of it was that we would move from the 72% swimmable rivers we have at the moment to 80% swimmable in 2030. Well, Canterbury's already there, so that's all good. And 90% as a national average in 2040. So that's a pretty ambitious target. There were a lot of measures put in place to achieve this. For example, the complete fencing out of stock from rivers by 2030, I think it was. Stock not including sheep and goats, which I still find a bit puzzling, but still all other stock have to be excluded from rivers. There was a lot of money put up, the Freshwater Improvement Fund. Coastal lagoons like Te Waihora and Wairīwa on our back doorstep were rolled into the freshwater consideration. They'd been excluded previously. There was greater recognition for iwi rights, te mana o te wai. And they produced a lot of swimmability maps, of one I've just showed you at the beginning, the map of New Zealand, to provide better guidance to the public about where and when to swim. The new NPSs also included, so this is the 2017 version, include a little bit of a revision of their former cyanobacterial guidelines, so these are also for human health, but they weren't markedly changed from before. I just want you to notice that once again we're talking about these percentile values. 80% of the data has to meet the criteria that are given. The national bottom line in this case is more acceptable. Right, so I haven't totally bamboozled you with statistics. Let's end with some practical advice on how do we decide whether we're going to swim or not. So this river here is actually the Esk River up just north of Napier. I was there over Christmas. Clearly, I took the photo of the 4 young New Zealanders trying to decide whether they were going to swim or not. What should they have been looking for? What was the first thing they should be looking for on the side of that river? Sorry? Algae? Even before they start looking for algae? Signage, yes. If there is a major problem at that, a fairly popular swimming site, there will be signage. There will be no swimming signs. If there's an algal bloom, there'll be an algal bloom sign. At many sites, there is a little sign which has a barcode or a QR code on it that you can scan with your phone, and it will take you directly to the latest monitoring data for that site. Particularly good with Greater Wellington Regional Council, I noticed while I was in that region. At Christmas, other councils have taken it up to a greater or lesser extent. You can always go to the national site for this kind of data. And I can't promote this enough really. The Land, Air, Water, Aotearoa website, very easy to get to, very easy to use, will tell you immediately, right when you're standing on the side of this river, what its last monitoring data was. Was the E. coli high when it was measured last? And it can also tell you, if you delve down into the data a little bit, as I have done in this exercise, what its history of data is. So, for example, if I jumped on Lawa now, and I found that site, which is this one here, is Estdale area, and this is the Esk River here, you'll see the site is orange at the moment. You'll also see a little sign on here to say that recreational monitoring has finished for the year. So this orange, which is caution advised, which means it's in that sort of medium category, relates to the last 3 years of recreational monitoring data. And if you delve down into that, you can find that data. So it's showing you for the last recreational swimming period, which was last summer, most of the time it was pretty good. On 3 occasions it was up a bit, and there were 2 times when you should not have been swimming there. But during the recreational season, you'll be standing right there and you can get the last data that came through. This is extremely powerful. The regional councils are feeding all of their recreational monitoring data, and their other data actually, into this lower data set. And with time, it's becoming more and more useful as a data set. If we have favourite swimming spots in our region, and I think many of us do, what can we do to make sure we know more about those sites and how they are usually, for swimming? The ECAN website, which has just been revamped and is actually looking pretty good, will take you directly to swimming water quality information. You can find that report that I referred to here, the annual summary of monitoring data. You can look up your spot in there. You can see what its grade is. You can also see whether it's improving or becoming worse with time. And it's quite comprehensive monitoring throughout the region that they do, both for E. coli and for cyanobacteria, those ones that are going to be of problems, the toxic cyanobacteria. You can, of course, also go to the LAWA site. They will have the last 3 years of data. You can access that as well. If we look at this, we can see that Coes Ford and all those areas around Te Waihora, based on their previous data, are considered to be unsuitable for swimming. Does this mean you wouldn't swim there or not even consider it for swimming? No, it doesn't. Check the LAWA website when you want to go swimming and you'll find out what the latest results are. Remember, a lot of that data we looked at for Coes Ford was well below the good swimming criteria, wasn't it? You can't expect the council to be there to monitor every site that you may whimsically decide to swim in Canterbury. They're only going to monitor the popular swimming sites. So if you are trying to make this decision at an unmonitored site, there's no data on LAWA, there's no data in your regional council, you still want to go for a swim, think about the landscape. Are you surrounded by bush? Are you surrounded by farms? Are you surrounded by dairy farms? Are you in the upper part of a catchment where you could have a bit more confidence? Are you in the lower part of a catchment where you need to be a little bit more wary? Those kind of things can inform your decision initially. Never go swimming after heavy rain because that is what washes the E. coli into the water. Give yourself 48 hours at least after heavy rain has stopped before you go for a swim. Avoid swimming if the clarity is less than it usually is. Now, with all those provisos about using clarity in Canterbury water, this is still quite useful. Even the Waimakariri, it's always turbid. Sometimes it's a beautiful blue, sometimes it's an angry brown, and much more turbid. Be aware of that. A very recent paper that's come out of NIWA, Rob Davis-Colley and his colleagues, in fact it was only published last month in the Journal of Water and Health, has shown that clarity might actually be quite a useful indicator of E. coli content. He's used all of the data in New Zealand to look at a correlation and found that if you can see a metre through the water, then there's a very good chance you're below that 550 E. coli per 100 mils. Now, Canterbury rivers are not going to fall into this. Canterbury rivers are going to be some of these outliers down here where they're glacially fed. So just be aware that as long as you can see a metre or a metre and a half through the water, it's looking fairly promising. Don't swim if there's abundant cyanobacteria. Our students look for these things using special viewers, but you can use just an ordinary swimming mask or a pair of goggles and look at the bottom of the stream. Are you seeing that goopy green nostoc, or are you seeing black leathery mats of formidium? If you are, then they're pretty abundant. Don't get in there. More importantly, don't let your dog get in there. You can always check LAWA for other sites on the same water body. Just because you want to swim here doesn't mean there's not another site on that river which is a popular swimming hole. Have a look at LAWA and see whether they've got any data for elsewhere on that body. The pink asterisks are just to cover off any other water-based recreation as well, which this would apply equally well to. So, take-home messages. Be aware of the health risks and know how to avoid them. This is just like basic water safety. You're not going to jump into a flooded river. Think about the state of the river that you're about to enter in terms of its contamination as well. Very important that we don't give up on freshwater swimming. I think. If we roll over and say, well, okay, we can no longer drink it, I guess we can no longer swim in it as well, then the battle is lost. Very important that we don't give up. Aspire to and expect to be able to swim and recreate safely in our rivers and streams and lakes. Keep the pressure on your zone committees, ECAN. I'm smiling at David Cagle at the back there. And the New Zealand government to aim for constantly improving swimability. It's not a nice word, but it is a word that really captures that desire to swim safely in our freshwater systems. Thank you for listening. I'd like to acknowledge first of all Murray Webster, my father, whose tales of epic tramps and adventures, particularly in the Canterbury region from his youth, led me to believe that I would always be able to swim safely in our waters, and I would note that he's just turned 91. And so he didn't sustain any long-term damage from being immersed in Canterbury rivers, though I do think his time of swimming in cold rivers is probably over. I'd also like to acknowledge the summer soldiers of the regional councils, those water quality officers, and often a team of students that they have working for them over summer, who do monitor the bathing beach quality at a time when the rest of us are on holiday. So thank you. Questions? Comments? Yes?
The statistics of the maps that you've shown, are they based on summer sampling or year-round evenly or a mixture?
It depends which ones you're referring to. The recreational monitoring is done and the comparisons are made for the recreational monitoring, so that summer season monitoring. When we look at the MFE data, that actually includes both the recreational monitoring plus a lot of other monitoring data. So the routine monitoring for each region, the river monitoring from Niwa, some cyanobacterial monitoring from Cawthron. It's a much larger data set when we're looking at the national level monitoring. It can be quite difficult to work out exactly what data has been used. For example, ECAN, when they do their grades, they use the last 5 years' worth of recreational data. When the Lawa site does its grades, it used the last 3 years of recreational data. So it's not always apples and apples. But you can usually find out what's been done if you dig. Yes?
What changes would you like to see for our rivers and lakes to be swimmable?
For lakes and rivers, I think we need to stop the degree of contamination of them. I think the measures that the government, the last government, had proposed, as in fencing off stock from rivers, is a huge step in the right direction. I think that will make a difference. But we really need to re-examine the way that we use the land in our catchments and the intensity of our farming practices. It's going to be a very difficult catch-up game if we keep just trying to mend fences after agricultural development has occurred. Sorry, the guy behind you was the one.
Do you think being able to swim in our urban rivers is a reasonable aspiration?
I do. Yes, I do. I don't think we should let that one go at all. I've inadvertently swam in our urban rivers. Can't say I've ever deliberately jumped in, but I've certainly been in them. Yes, it's a harder, you have a greater variety of contaminants in urban rivers. There's probably a greater degree of care. It may not be just E. coli that you are concerned about in urban rivers, but I think it's an achievable goal. I would like to see it happen. Yes. Sorry, just in front.
Is there a publicly accessible map of all the consented waste discharges so that you can go to swim afterwards instead of below?
That's a good question, and I don't know. David, do you know? I don't know. They will be resource consented. I don't know of any map. Sorry?
Canterbury maps, a really good source for that information of what resource consented and where.
Yes.
You do have to search around a bit to find a specific discharge list, but if you're really interested, you can.
There should be very, very few deliberate discharges of E. coli into our waterways, right? From dairy sheds, from sewage treatment plants, from everything else. That happens very rarely, that we actually have a point source discharge of sewage, right? It's coming from more diffuse sources during heavy rainfall, which makes it a little bit harder to, go that upstream or downstream route. Yes?
Do you
Consider it possible for it to be above soil quality, so like would it possibly get lower levels of it's drinkable? Or is that
That's really laying down a challenge. I don't think it is, because even if we were to clean up all the sources of E. coli, it's very likely that Giardia would remain in most of our freshwater systems. That was introduced to New Zealand in the 1970s, and I don't think there's any turning back the clock on that one.
How optimistic are you that we'll hit those 2040 targets?
Mm.
And like what sort of chance do you give us getting?
Well, I'm an internal optimist. I am hopeful. I do think the measures that they put forward in the clean water proposal, if implemented, will make a huge difference. My fear is that they will, if we don't make it, they'll juggle the statistics to make it look like we did. That's an unfair criticism, I know. I'm hopeful that we can get there, really, and I think it would be a great thing for New Zealand if we did. Can I just ask someone who hasn't asked a question yet?
Different question. At the Maruya hot pools, where they're doing an excellent job of marketing, when you go into the hot pool, you become covered with little bits of black slime or overlap, and that is on the rocks and everything. It's supposed to be very good for you. What is it?
I don't know. I have been there. I think I was more worried about the sandflies than the black slime. I don't know. If it was Formidium, you would not be in there. Yeah, they wouldn't do that to you. But it's likely to be a type of bacteria that can tolerate those slightly higher temperatures. But if it was a toxin-producing cyanobacteria, they would be being shut down very quickly. Yeah, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. Yeah. Ashley?
given the main metrics that are used to assess the swimability seem to be driven from influences of agricultural factors, what relates to the question of urban assessed, should these rivers be assessed in the same way as swimability based on the cyanobacteria, or should there be other development methods to assess the rivers?
Well, at the moment, if there are swimming sites within an urban centre, they are based on exactly the same criteria, that they are judged on the same criteria that we've been talking about. I think what would come into play at that point is if there was reason for concern, let's say you're directly downstream of a industrial runoff area or something like that, then I think the council would introduce further monitoring to make sure that those levels didn't exceed the kind of guidelines that are given in ANZAC. We'd go harking back to those earlier guidelines, which were a little bit more broad in their reach. I can't speak for regional councils, of course, but that's certainly what I would do if I was a regional council. One of the things for urban swimming often is the amount of contaminated sediment that's in the bottom of the urban river, which can make swimming A, quite unpleasant because it's all soft and squidgy down there, and B, can carry high levels of contaminants within that sediment. So to me, urban swimming, if we want to, promote it and want it to become more frequent, we'll probably have to do something about the contaminated sediment on the bottom as well. Yes?
slightly different, but are you aware of studies being done, we're talking about people in the water? Are there corresponding studies being done about fish in these rivers, like at what stage they start to decline? And that sort of
In response to E. coli?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I've had a chat to our ecologists several times about this. Some of them are interested in it, they just haven't really worked out a way to study it yet. E. coli are quite unstable outside your body, they die off quite quickly, so it's quite difficult to sort of set up experiments and work it out.
I was just thinking about Coast Ford. As a child, we used to spend a lot of time at Coast Ford, and part of the joy of it was jumping and trying to jump on fish. There's so many fish there, and now you're lucky if you spot a cyclone.
That wasn't you in the photo on the Lilo, was it?
No.
Yeah, well, I think the reason the fish is there is probably not because of the E. coli. There's, you know, as you would know, there's a lot of water quality issues at Coast Ford with the high nutrients and the algae that's there that are going to start to push those fish out as well. I doubt it's E. coli, but it is quite an active question at the moment as to what effect E. coli has on the aquatic ecosystems themselves. Yep. Can I just ask this one at that? Yeah.
Out in public opinion, is there anything preventing the next government from removing current standards for livability or whatever, like swimability in that? Is there any restrictions on what they can do? So we'll do it improve the standards, but in theory, could they just strip completely back and do what they like with it?
I'm not a politician and I couldn't tell you. My feeling from the new government is that they would hate to be seen to be doing that. David Parker certainly has kind of stepped up recently and made some comments about downscaling our dairy industry, for example. And my feeling is that he's quite determined to carry on and to build on any environmental gains we've made so far and to make progress even faster. But politicians are what politicians are. Yes.
Do you know how they actually detect the E. coli? I know some of the stuff said colony forming units and some of it didn't. So that's in like 48-hour test. Is there a rapid identification test for E. coli like genetic? And could that be something that would be cheap enough for a company available to do their own on-site analysis?
That is certainly an aim. Most of the E. coli monitoring that's done is either MPN, which is most probable number, or CFUs, which is coliforming units per 100 mils, and they are just slightly different methods, as you may well be aware. The fastest rate you can get is kind of a 24-hour turning around. But this is what ESR are working on. They're working on the molecular techniques that might help us both identify where the bacteria has come from and develop tests that are faster and more specific for different types of E. coli. Yes.
I was just wondering if there was a place for food gathering safety or making it high in all of this.
There is, and in fact the original MAF guidelines that came out, those ones from 2003, not MAF, MOH, that I was referring to, they were for recreational safety and shellfish gathering, for example. The ability of various types of mahinga kai to become contaminated in these contaminated rivers is again a pretty active field of study at the moment, and part of taking greater account of iwi water rights in the clean water package was around protecting mahinga kai. So yes, it's got a pretty high profile at the moment. Yes, maybe just two more questions. They told me I had to shut down at 8 o'clock. Any last questions? Yes.
On your take of homeless that people have used it, that we should continue putting pressure on the zone communities but how, what are some ways that you suggest that we go about doing this?
I think keeping it in front of your zone committee members is important. In the Selwyn, I think it's pretty much a key issue for that zone committee to try and improve the state of the Selwyn River and Coast Ford. But I'm thinking other zone committees as well, attend some of the zone committee meetings. They're open to the public, go along, try and find out what they are, what their thoughts are on improving swimming in their region, in their area, catchment. I think it's just important not to let this fall out of sight, not to kind of assume that, well, it's now too risky to swim, let's not do it. The issue will disappear, we will have, the horse will have bolted and we won't get a chance to get it back again. So I think just become engaged. Last question, right up the top, the guy that's waving, sorry.
I guess a follow-on question from that, do you have a sense that the zone committees and ECAN and who is responsible for monitoring, looking at it, are actually taking action against specific instances of people on the flowing, things like that, and changing the environment about people that do it? And I guess it comes back from something I was just sitting thinking about. Many weeks ago I saw an article about a whole lot of eels that basically everything in the stream being killed by the weeks ago. I've never seen any reports since about this is what caused it. This is any action being taken. Do you have a sense that we have an environment where there's a desire to keep that improve?
For the first point, for swimming, I think most of our problems with E. coli levels actually relate to diffuse sources of pollution. So it's not so much a large E. coli level being attributable to one particular polluter. I think the number of effluent ponds that spill over into our river systems are very small compared to the amount of general runoff that we get from the land every time it rains. Regarding ECAN and whether they are onto people who cause problems in our rivers, I think they are taking the big picture to some extent, knowing that most of our problems at the moment relate to diffuse sources. So they do have an active program of trying to improve farmer behaviour, farm management, environmental management plans for farms, keeping fertiliser application rates down, a whole raft of different things that they are doing to try and reduce those diffuse sources, which I think are pretty key. In terms of their follow-up action for individuals who may contaminate water, it can be pretty hard sometimes to see through a regional council to see what's going on beneath the surface, but in my experience there's a lot going on beneath the surface that you don't hear about. They have teams given over to enforcement and actions that are taken against individuals, but you don't normally hear about it unless it goes to court. But that's my opinion, I guess. Okay, well, I'm supposed to put up this last lecture, this last slide, and to tell you that something. Oh yes, you can. Where did I put it? Sorry, now I'm off my own topic. I'm lost. Right, I just encourage you to attend the UC Connect public lectures, which are free. You can register online to receive regular emails about upcoming lectures if you are interested. So I hope we see you again. I can't guarantee that all your professors will be in wetsuits. But thank you very much for turning out tonight.